The fog came down from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the way fog does in New Mexico in October. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the patient certainty of something that has been doing this for centuries. Cole Harlan rode into it an hour before sunrise. Shadow moved at a walk through the white. The horse could see less than Cole could, and Cole could see about 20 feet. Cole had been riding for 6 days, not toward anything specific. The movement between things, the days when the road was the point rather than a means to it. He wasn't thinking about the territory. He was thinking about Edmund Cross. About a name that had appeared in 3 states. About a man who moved through the legal infrastructure of the West like a current moves through water, invisibly, powerfully. Shadow stopped, not because Cole asked, because Shadow had heard something. Cole listened. Through the fog, through the silence of the mountain morning, a bell, small, slow, the kind that rings simply to mark the hour. The church appeared out of the fog the way things appear when the fog is moving and you are still. Not by arriving, but by being revealed. Small, adobe, a single bell tower with a wooden cross. He had not been inside a church since 1881. He didn't think of himself as a religious man, but something in the sight of that small adobe building in the fog produced in him the specific need for stillness. He dismounted, tied Shadow to the post outside, put his hand briefly on the horse's neck. "I won't be long," he said. He went inside. Cole sat in the last pew. He took off his hat. To sit somewhere that was not the road, to let the stillness find him. After a while, he knelt. Not prayer, something quieter. Checking what your hands felt like without the weight. He heard the voice from the front of the church. Low, barely above a whisper. "God forgive me." Cole didn't move. "But those men need killing." Cole raised his head. At the altar, his back to the pews, stood a priest. Old, small, white hair above the black collar. He was not speaking to Cole. He didn't know Cole was there. Cole thought, that is a man saying something true. He stayed in the pew and waited. Before we continue, a priest standing at an altar in the fog, saying a thing that a priest should not say, because he has heard enough confessions and known enough truth to have run out of sympathy for the men still breathing. What Cole finds when he pulls the thread is a story about what happens when the law is used as a weapon, when justice fails quietly, with documents, with influence. Subscribe if you haven't. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. Stay with it. The turns come where you don't expect them. His name was Father Sebastian Vela, 68 years old. He had been the priest of San Agustín de las Piedras for 31 years, arrived in 1857, 3 years before the war, and had stayed through everything that came after. The village had been larger once, 140 families at its peak. Sheep ranching, some agriculture, the specific economy of a people who had been on this land for generations. Now there were fewer than 30 families. The ones who remained were mostly old, mostly quiet, mostly staying because the dead they were responsible for were buried here, and moving meant abandoning them. Father Vela had stayed with them. He had stayed because they needed him, also because he was stubborn. He would have said the first. Both were true. When he turned from the altar and found Cole Harlan sitting in the last pew, his face moved through several things in rapid sequence. Surprise, alarm, embarrassment, and then something more complicated that Cole couldn't immediately name. "How long?" Vela said. "Long enough," Cole said. Vela walked to the pew across from Cole's and sat down. He looked at the pale blue eyes looking at him with the quality of attention that the priest recognized from years of looking at people who were waiting for something. "You heard what I said." "Yes." "It was not meant for you." "I know," Cole said, "but you meant it." Father Vela looked at his hands. "I am an old man who has spent 31 years hearing the truth from people in this village. And the truth, accumulated over 31 years, does things to a person. What did it do to you?" It made me understand that there are men who deserve forgiveness and men who deserve consequences, and that God's patience with the difference is considerably longer than mine. Whose confessions? Cole said. Vela looked at the altar. I cannot tell you that. The confessional is the confessional. I'm not asking for names. I'm asking about what's happening in this territory right now, because that sentence was about something specific. Father Vela looked at him for a long time. Who are you? Cole Harlan. The priest held the name for a moment. I've heard of you. Most people have. That's not always useful information. No, Vela said. But sometimes it is. There have been deaths, he said. In Santa Fe, in Albuquerque, in Las Cruces. Men of standing. Men with property and names that appear in the territory's history books. Officially, some have been accidents. One was ruled natural causes. One has not been found yet. And unofficially, Cole said. Unofficially, 5 men who did a very specific thing many years ago are dead. And the 6th is afraid. What did they do? Father Vela put his hands flat on his knees. They destroyed a family, completely, legally, without a single bullet. He told it the way things get told when they've been sitting inside a person for too long. Not cleanly, not chronologically, but in the order that the weight demanded. The family's name was Castillo. Rodrigo Castillo had been a sheep rancher in the Mora Valley, north of Las Vegas. His land grant was original, Spanish colonial, confirmed under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. 15,000 acres of valley land that his grandfather's grandfather had received from the Spanish crown in 1789. The grant was real. The family had been there for 3 generations. None of that had been enough. In 1869, when Rodrigo Castillo was 42 years old, 3 children, a wife named Elena, a herd of 4,000 sheep, 6 men had decided that what the Castillo family had was more valuable than what the Castillo family was. The 6 men were not outlaws. That was the essential thing. A lawyer named Harwood, a land agent named Price, a banker named Colton, a rancher named Dobb, a politician named Strickler, and a man named Whitmore. Edmund Whitmore. Cole's hands were still on his knees when the priest said the name. Whitmore, Cole said. You know the name? Vela said. Tell me what he was to them, Cole said. He was the coordinator. The others had their pieces. Whitmore understood how the pieces fit. He knew which judge would accept which argument. He knew how the land office filing would proceed. He knew what the timing needed to be so that by the time anyone understood what had happened, the transfer would be recorded and the family would have no legal standing to contest it. Cole looked at the altar. Edmund Whitmore. He had seen that name in a letter from Benjamin Aldridge's lawyer 3 weeks ago, as a known associate of Edmund Cross, as someone who had operated in New Mexico territory in the 1862nd and 1872nd before moving his operations north. The thread had an end after all. It was just longer than he'd known. The family, Cole said. What happened? Vela told the rest of it. The false accusation had been the decisive instrument. Rodrigo Castillo was accused of murdering a shepherd who worked for Dobb, a man whose body was found on Castillo land in circumstances that Harwood's legal work had arranged to be as damning as possible. The trial was in Santa Fe. The jury was chosen by men who knew the outcome that was required. Rodrigo was convicted in 3 days. He died in territorial prison in 1873, 4 years into a life sentence of pneumonia. Like Caleb Dune, Cole said quietly. What? Vela said. Nothing, Cole said. Go on. With Rodrigo imprisoned, the land transfer proceeded. Elena Castillo contested it, hired a lawyer with what little remained. The lawyer died suddenly of a riding accident before the hearing. The next lawyer was one of Harwood's associates. He lost the case in 60 days. Elena Castillo died in 1877. She had been living in a single room above a cantina in Las Vegas for 4 years. Her 3 children had been separated, the oldest sent to relatives who didn't want him, the middle taken by the church, the youngest disappeared into the territory. The oldest child, Cole said. Miguel, Vela said. Miguel Castillo. How old is he now? He would be 47. Cole did the arithmetic. Miguel had been 16 when his father was accused. Old enough to understand everything. Old enough to carry it. You know where he is, Cole said. Vela was quiet. The confessional is the confessional, he said. Father, Cole said, you told me 5 men are dead. The 6th is afraid. And you said, at the altar, that those men need killing. The priest looked at his hands. I also said, God forgive me. Yes, Cole said. That part is important too. What made you pray for forgiveness? Not for saying they needed killing, for something else. Vela looked up. Because I know who the 6th man is, and I have not told Miguel that he is wrong about him. Who is the 6th man? A man named Thomas Abner. He was a clerk in the Territorial Land Office in 1869. He processed the documents. He stamped the filings. He knows what was done because he was the mechanism through which some of it was done. Is he guilty? Vela looked at the altar. He was 23 years old. He did what he was told to do by men who were above him in a system he didn't understand well enough to know it was being used. He stamped papers. He filed records. He did not know what those papers would accomplish. By the time he understood, it was too late, and he was afraid of what would happen if he tried to speak. Has he spoken about it? Not publicly, but to me, many times over many years. That is the weight I carry. That I know Thomas Abner is not guilty in the way the others were guilty, and that I know Miguel Castillo believes he is. And Miguel's list has 6 names. Yes. And Thomas Abner is the 6th. Yes. Cole was quiet for a long time. Through the high windows, the fog was beginning to thin. What are you asking me to do? Cole said. I am not asking you anything, Vela said. You walked into my church. You heard something you weren't meant to hear. Whatever you do with it is between you and whatever you use instead of God. Cole looked at the priest. You could have stopped. When you turned and saw me, you could have said nothing. Yes, Vela said. Why didn't you? Father Sebastian Vela looked at the cross above the altar, at the candles that had been burning since before Cole arrived, at 31 years of a village diminishing around him while he stayed. Because I am tired, he said, of being the only person who knows the truth. Here's what most people who lived in the New Mexico Territory in the 1,870 seconds and 1,880 seconds knew but couldn't prove. The Santa Fe Ring. It wasn't called that officially. It didn't have membership cards or meeting minutes. It was an informal network of lawyers, politicians, land agents, and businessmen, predominantly connected to the territorial government, who had identified that the adjudication of Spanish and Mexican land grants represented the largest single transfer of wealth in the history of the American West. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 had promised that the land rights of Mexican citizens would be respected under United States law. What followed was not consistent with that promise. The adjudication process required families to prove their claims before a surveyor general appointed from Washington, who often spoke no Spanish, had no background in Spanish colonial land law, and was evaluating documents in a legal tradition entirely foreign to the system under which they had been created. The result was systematic dispossession on a scale that the individual cases couldn't convey. Millions of acres, hundreds of families, communities that had existed for generations on land that was, by the legal standards of the country that had just taken it, suddenly and efficiently not theirs. The men who knew how the adjudication process worked, who understood its gaps, its delays, its vulnerability to competing claims, were positioned to benefit in ways that produced extraordinary wealth. Edmund Whitmore had been one of those men. The destruction of the Castillo family in 1869 was not an exceptional case. It was a typical one. What made it significant to Miguel Castillo was that it was his family. And what made it significant to Cole Harlan was the name Edmund Whitmore, which appeared in his notes as a known associate of Edmund Cross, which meant the thread he had been following for 2 years had just developed a new direction. South, into the past, into a family destroyed by a man who was connected to the man Cole was looking for. Cole spent 4 days in the territory before he found what he was looking for. He went to Las Vegas first, the New Mexico one, the older one, at the edge of the Sangre de Cristo range. He found the newspaper archive. Las Vegas had had a newspaper since 1879. Cole spent 2 days reading about 5 deaths over the past 14 months. Harrison Price, land agent, Santa Fe, found at the bottom of his office stairs, ruled accident, age 71. Martin Colton, banker, Albuquerque, heart failure during a bath, age 68. James Dobb, rancher, Las Cruces, thrown from his horse on a road he had ridden 1,000 times, age 63. Aldous Strickler, former territorial politician, Santa Fe, stroke, age 74. Victor Harwood, lawyer, Albuquerque, found in his hotel room the morning after attending a bar association dinner, ruled natural causes, age 66. Cole read the accounts carefully. Accidents, natural causes, the deaths of old men in a territory where old men died every season. But all 5 men had been involved in the destruction of the Castillo family in 1869. All 5 had died in the past 14 months. Cole was not a detective. What he had was the ability to read situations, to understand the shape of things from the visible edges and the specific pattern of the space between. The pattern said, these men were helped to their deaths. The pattern said, by someone who understood their routines well enough to make the deaths look like what they looked like. Miguel Castillo had waited 20 years. 14 more months was nothing. He found Thomas Abner in Albuquerque, not by looking for him specifically, by following the logic of where the 6th man on a list would be in a city where 2 of the 5 dead had lived. Abner was 62 years old. He worked as a bookkeeper for a mercantile company on Gold Avenue. Cole watched him for a day before approaching him. Abner was careful, not in the way of a man with a guilty conscience, but in the way of a man carrying a specific fear for a specific number of months. He varied his route. He looked behind him. He ate alone and left quickly. He was afraid, but he hadn't left. That told Cole something too. A man who was purely afraid would run. A man who believed, despite the fear, that something required him to stay. That man didn't run. Cole sat down at the table beside Thomas Abner in the cantina on 2nd Street on a Tuesday afternoon and said the name. Miguel Castillo. Abner went very still. I'm not him, Cole said. I'm not with him. I'm someone who is trying to understand what's happening before it finishes happening. Abner looked at him with the specific look of a man who has resigned himself to not knowing whether what arrives will be the thing he feared or the thing he hoped for. Who are you? Abner said. Someone the priest told, Cole said. Abner closed his eyes for a moment. Sebastian, he said. Not a curse, not an accusation. Just the name, said in the tone of someone who has finally heard the thing he expected. He didn't betray you, Cole said. He told me about the list, not your name. I found you. How? Because a man who is afraid and hasn't run is here for a reason. What is it? Abner looked at the table. I have the original documents, he said. The story of Thomas Abner required the evening to tell. Cole listened in a room above the cantina that Abner rented by the week. Spare, careful. The room of a man who has been living as if he might need to leave quickly. Abner had been 23 in 1869. A clerk in the Territorial Land Office because he was good with numbers and documents, and because a man named Harwood had given him a position that paid better than anything else available to a young man in Santa Fe at that time. He had processed the filings. He had not understood at first what the filings were. What Harwood's group had done with the Castillo claim was sophisticated. A competing claim had been filed from a shell company that Price established, asserting that the 1,789 Spanish grant document was a forgery. Not that the Castillo family had misrepresented it, that the document itself was not authentic. This was false, but it was a legal argument, and legal arguments required time and resources to refute, and the Castillo family's resources were being simultaneously eliminated by Colton's bank calling its mortgage. Abner had processed all of it, stamped the filings, recorded the proceedings, moved the paper through the system that was consuming the Castillo family as he watched. He had understood, not immediately but within weeks, that what he was facilitating was not legal process, but its appearance. He had said nothing, not because he didn't care, because he was 23 years old and frightened, and because the men orchestrating it were the men who employed him and the men who had relationships with every authority in the territory. "I was a coward," Abner said. The flat statement of a man who has had 40 years to arrive at a verdict about himself and has stopped arguing with it. "You were 23, Cole said. "That's an explanation," Abner said. "It's not a defense." Cole didn't argue with that. Abner went to the floorboard. The same places, Cole thought. Iron boxes and floorboards. The specific hiding places of people who have something true they need to keep. What Abner had kept for 40 years was a set of copies made during the proceedings. Carefully, methodically, with the precision of a man whose hands had implemented a decision before the rest of him agreed. The copies showed the original Castillo grant, the competing claim and its specific misrepresentations, the timeline of the filings, the names, everything that had been done and who had done it. "Harwood and Price are dead," Cole said. "I know," Abner said. "Colton, Dobb, and Strickler. I know." "Whitmore," Cole said. Abner looked up. Whitmore died in 1882, in Denver, officially a business dispute. No one was charged. Cole filed that. "You've been tracking this," Cole said, "for 14 months, since Price. Why not go to the law when it started?" Abner looked at him with the eyes of a man who has thought about this for a long time. Because the law in this territory was built by the men who did this. Harwood sat on the territorial court for 11 years. Strickler chaired the committee that appointed territorial marshals for a decade. The documents I have could have been used against them in 1869. By 1888, most of what they built is still standing. "And Miguel Castillo is doing what the law wouldn't," Cole said. "Yes." "And your name is on his list." "Yes." "Are you afraid?" Abner looked at the documents on the table. "I have been afraid every day for 40 years. Not of Miguel, of what I did. Of what it cost a family that had done nothing wrong." He looked at Cole. "What frightens me is that 5 men are dead, and the world is functionally the same as it was when they were alive." "What would change that?" Cole said. Abner looked at the documents. "These, in the right hands. Not the territorial court. That's still compromised. But the Federal Land Commission has been reviewing New Mexico grant adjudications since 1885. The Court of Private Land Claims is being established. There are federal judges who have no connection to the Santa Fe Ring." "You've been holding these documents for 40 years, Cole said. "Why haven't you taken them there yourself?" Abner looked at him. "Because until 14 months ago, I believed I deserved to be on the list." Cole held that. "And now?" "Now I think the documents deserve to exist more than I deserve to disappear." Cole found Miguel Castillo in 3 days. Not because Miguel was hiding badly, but because a man who has spent 20 years building towards something and is within one name of completing it develops a specific quality of presence, drawn to the places where the final thing needs to happen. Thomas Abner spent time in Albuquerque, and Miguel Castillo had come to Albuquerque to watch him. Cole found him in a rooming house on Tijeras Avenue. He knocked. The door opened, and the man on the other side had his father's face in the version that 47 years of a specific life produce. Worn, clear-eyed, the face of someone who has been carrying a weight so long the weight has become part of his posture. Miguel Castillo looked at Cole. "I don't know you," Miguel said. "No," Cole said, "but I know who you are and what you've been doing. I'd like to talk before you do the last thing." Miguel looked at him for a long moment. "Cole Harlan," he said. "Yes." Miguel stepped back from the door, not inviting, just not closing it. Cole went in. The conversation that followed was the hardest kind, not because Miguel was hostile, because he was right. That was the specific difficulty. The man was right about what had been done, right about who had done it, right about what the law had allowed to happen. 5 men had died. 5 men who had destroyed a family with legal instruments and the specific cruelty of power applied quietly, over time, without leaving marks. Cole could not argue with the justice of the first 5. He didn't try. What he could argue about was the 6th. He laid it out the way Father Vela had laid it out to him. Thomas Abner, 23 years old in 1869, a clerk who processed papers he didn't fully understand in a system he didn't control. A man who had known the truth for 40 years and had been keeping the documents because he understood they were more important than his fear. Miguel listened the way men listen when they've spent decades building a certainty and are being asked to look at it from a different angle. "He was there," Miguel said. "Yes." "He processed the documents." "Yes." "Without him, the filings couldn't have proceeded as quickly." "Probably not. That's true." "Then he is responsible." "He is responsible for being a frightened young man who did what he was told in a system designed to use frightened young men," Cole said. "That is a different kind of responsible than what the other 5 did." "The result was the same for my family," Miguel said. "Yes," Cole said. "It was." Silence. "I'm not asking you to forgive him," Cole said. "I'm asking you to be accurate about what he is." Miguel looked at him. "You think accuracy matters at this point? I think you spent 20 years making sure of what you were doing and why. I think you've been deliberate because you didn't want to be wrong. I think the reason you haven't acted yet is because you have a question you can't answer." Miguel said nothing. "You're not sure about him," Cole said. "You've been watching him for months, and something you've seen doesn't fit the category he's supposed to be in." The room was very quiet. Miguel Castillo looked at the window. "He varied his route," Miguel said, "to work, from work. I've been watching for 7 months. A guilty man varies his route because he's afraid of being caught. An innocent man varies his route because he's afraid of dying for something he didn't do." He looked at Cole. "I couldn't tell which one he was." "He has documents," Cole said. "He's had them for 40 years. He made copies during the proceedings because something in him knew what was happening was wrong, and the record needed to exist." Miguel stared at him. "He has the original documents," Cole said. "The ones that show what Harwood and Price and Whitmore did. The ones that can go to the Federal Land Commission. The ones that can, 40 years late, put the truth into an official record." Something moved in Miguel Castillo's face. Not relief, not forgiveness. Something older and more complicated. The specific expression of a man who has been carrying a pure, clean, uncomplicated thing for a very long time, and is being shown that the thing is not pure or clean or uncomplicated. "The documents won't give me back my family," Miguel said. "No," Cole said. "They won't bring my father out of the ground. No. They won't give my brother back, whatever happened to him. No." Cole looked at him. "But they will say what happened, officially, in a federal record, with names and dates and evidence. They will say that your father was innocent, that the land was yours, that what was done deliberately by specific men for specific reasons." Miguel was quiet for a long time. "Is that enough?" he said. Not to Cole, to something else. Cole let the question sit. "I don't know, but it's what's available. And if you kill him, it goes with him." Miguel Castillo looked at the window for a long time. The Albuquerque afternoon was moving toward gold, and then toward the specific blue that comes before dark, the color that the high desert produces in the hour before the light goes. Whitmore, Miguel said. Dead, Cole said. 1882, Denver. The man he worked with is a man named Edmund Cross. Cross is still alive, still operating, still doing what Whitmore did, just further north. Miguel looked at him. You're following Cross, Miguel said. I'm looking for him, Cole said. There's a difference. But his connection to Whitmore, that's in Abner's documents too. Something shifted, not dramatically, not with words. Just the specific, invisible shift of a decision being made in the place where decisions actually get made. Not in conversation, not in response to argument, but in the room inside a person where the only other occupant is the weight they've been carrying. I want to see the documents, Miguel said. Cole arranged it for the following morning. He brought Thomas Abner to a room in a hotel on Central Avenue, public enough that neither man would feel trapped, private enough that the conversation could happen. The two men looked at each other across a table, 40 years of damage between them. A clerk who had been 23 and afraid. A boy who had been 16 and watching everything he had disappear. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Cole stayed near the door, not to prevent anything, because the room needed to belong to the two men in it, and he was not one of them. Miguel Castillo looked at Thomas Abner. You know who I am. Yes. You know what I've done. Yes. Are you afraid of me? Abner looked at him. I've been afraid of you for 14 months, but not in the way you might think. I've been afraid that you would come and I would be gone before I'd done what the documents needed me to do. Miguel looked at the case that Abner had brought. Show me, he said. Abner opened the case. The documents were 40 years old. The paper had the specific quality of things that have been kept carefully, not crumbling, not yellow, but carrying in their texture the weight of the years during which they had been hidden and maintained. Miguel looked at them. He looked at his father's name. At the original grant document, the 1,789 Spanish Crown grant, the one the competing claim had called a forgery. At the competing claim itself, with the specific misrepresentations that Abner's notes in the margin identified. At the names. He looked at the names for a long time. Cole watched him. He thought about Father Vela in the church, about a man at an altar saying a true thing in a fog, about 20 years and 5 deaths, and a clerk who had made copies because something in him knew the record had to exist. He thought about Edmund Cross and Edmund Whitmore, and the specific pattern of men who understood that the most durable form of power was the kind already embedded in the systems that everyone else depended on. The Federal Land Commission, Miguel said finally. Yes, Abner said. These would go there. If you allow me to deliver them, Abner said. I have a contact, a federal examiner building a case against the adjudication practices for 3 years. These documents would not be the only evidence, but they would be the clearest evidence of deliberate fraud in a specific case. Miguel looked at the document with his father's name. It won't restore the land, he said. No, the land transfers are recorded. Undoing them after 40 years is not legally possible in most cases. What the commission can do is declare the original adjudication fraudulent, put that in the federal record, assign responsibility, and in the cases where the current holders obtained the land through the fraudulent adjudication and are still operating, the commission has authority to pursue claims against them. Miguel Castillo was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that Cole would think about for years afterward. My father died in prison believing he had murdered a man. The last thing he would have known about himself was that he was a killer. He looked at Abner. Can the record say that he didn't? Abner looked at the documents. The record can say that the accusation was manufactured by men with a documented interest in his conviction, that no independent evidence supported the charge, that the proceeding was compromised from its inception. It can say, officially, federally, that your father's conviction was not justice. Miguel looked at the window. The morning light of Albuquerque in October was doing what it did, clear and specific and without sentiment. "Give me the documents," Miguel said. Abner looked at him. "I'm giving them to the commission. I'm asking if you'll let me." A very long silence. "Yes," Miguel Castillo said. Cole Harlan spent one more day in Albuquerque. He used it to write 2 letters. The first was to Arthur Pembroke, the lawyer in Helena who had helped with the Dune Ranch situation. Cole described what Abner had, the nature of the documents, the connection to the Santa Fe ring adjudications, the specific evidence of fraudulent proceedings in the Castillo case. He asked Pembroke to identify the federal examiner at the Court of Private Land Claims building the New Mexico grant adjudication case, and to facilitate the introduction. The second letter was to Benjamin Aldridge's lawyer in Denver. It contained 2 names, Edmund Whitmore and his documented role in the Castillo adjudication of 1,869, Edmund Cross and his documented association with Whitmore. The letter asked the lawyer to add this to the federal documentation that had been building around Cross since the Colorado proceedings. Cole sealed both letters, gave them to the post office on 2nd Street with enough money to ensure they moved quickly. Then he went to find Father Vela. He rode back to San Agustin de las Piedras through fog that was lighter this time, the morning fog, the kind that the sun was already working on. The church was unlocked. Father Vela was inside, at the altar. He turned when Cole came in. "It's resolved?" he said. "The documents are going to the Land Commission," Cole said. "Abner is taking them." "And Miguel?" "Miguel is going to let him." Vela was quiet. "He's going to disappear," Cole said. "5 deaths and no clear evidence will eventually produce an investigation. Staying in New Mexico creates risks he doesn't want to manage. He'll be all right. He's been surviving for 20 years. Vela nodded slowly. "And Abner," he said. "Abner will deliver the documents. After that, I don't know. He's been living in fear for 40 years. What you do after that's finished is a thing I can't predict." Vela looked at the altar. "What he did was wrong," Vela said. "Yes," Cole said, "but not as wrong as the others." "No." The priest was quiet. "The church has a concept of degrees of culpability. A man who knows and participates is different from a man who knows and remains silent. A man who remains silent is different from a man who doesn't know." "And Abner?" Cole said. "Abner knew and remained silent. For 40 years he remained silent and made copies and kept them because something in him couldn't let the record not exist. That is a man in conflict with himself. A man who did the wrong thing and spent 40 years trying to find a way to make it less wrong." He looked at Cole. "I don't know what God thinks of that. I know what I think." "What do you think?" "I think he is a man who had one chance to do the right thing, didn't take it, and spent 40 years looking for the chance again, and found it." Cole looked at the priest. "Is that enough?" Cole said, using the same question Miguel had asked. Father Sebastian Vela looked at the cross above the altar. "I don't know," he said, "but it's more than most people manage." In the autumn of 1888, the American West was in the process of being declared closed. Frederick Jackson Turner would articulate the thesis 5 years later, 1893, at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. But the closing had been underway for a decade already. The frontier line had effectively ceased to exist as a continuous geographic feature. What remained were pockets, places where the old dynamics still operated, where the law was thin and the distances were long, and the decisions that men made about each other still happened without the institutional infrastructure that elsewhere had replaced the personal. Cole Harlan operated in those pockets, not because he preferred violence or was running from something, but because the pockets were where certain things still needed to be done in the old way, by the old kind of man, and because the old kind of man was running out. Sitting in the church of San Agustin de las Piedras with Father Sebastian Vela, Cole thought about what Miguel Castillo was. Not a murderer, not a vigilante in the pulp fiction sense, A man who had looked at what the law had done to his family and decided that the law was not the instrument he would rely on to produce what justice required. Was he right? 5 men were dead. 5 men who had destroyed a family without leaving marks. 5 men whose deaths would never be officially attributed to anything other than accident and age. Cole had not tried to stop him. Not the first 5. Only the 6th, the one who was a different kind of guilty. The one who had spent 40 years carrying documents he should have delivered sooner. And even that, Cole had not done by force. Had not put a gun between Miguel and Thomas Abner. Had put a conversation there instead. Because sometimes that was what was available. Because the fastest draw in the room was the draw nobody sees, because nobody needed to reach for one. Caleb Dune had said that. Cole had learned it. And in a church in the fog-covered mountains of New Mexico, with a priest who had lost his faith in the institution of mercy without losing his faith in the existence of justice, Cole thought that it was still the truest thing he knew. The Court of Private Land Claims was formally established by Act of Congress in 1891. It was given jurisdiction to review the Spanish and Mexican land grant adjudications handled by the Surveyor General's office in the New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado territories. Among the cases it reviewed in its first year was the Castillo Grant of Mora Valley. The petition was filed by an attorney representing the estate of Rodrigo Castillo. Miguel Castillo's involvement was through a legal representative rather than in person, for reasons that the record did not explain. The documentary evidence submitted included, among other materials, a set of copies of the original adjudication proceedings made at the time by a land office clerk named Thomas Abner. Abner testified in writing, a deposition given in Santa Fe that took 3 days. He was 75 years old. The court's ruling, issued in 1893, found that the original adjudication of the Castillo Grant had been conducted in a manner inconsistent with the legal requirements of the time, and that the competing claim filed in 1869 had contained material misrepresentations that would have precluded it from consideration. The ruling further found that the criminal proceedings against Rodrigo Castillo were connected to the land dispute in ways that raised sufficient doubt about the integrity of those proceedings to warrant an official statement of concern. The land was not restored. 40 years of subsequent transfers made that legally impossible. But the federal record said what it said. It said Rodrigo Castillo had not received justice. It said the land was taken from his family by men who knew what they were doing and who used the law as the instrument. It said the names. Edmund Whitmore's death in 1882 was reviewed by the court's investigators as part of the broader inquiry into the Santa Fe Rings operations. The connection to Edmund Cross, documented in correspondence between Whitmore and Cross that other sources produced during the investigation, was noted in the commission's report. Not prosecuted. The evidence was circumstantial, and the statutes of limitations had long since expired, but noted in the federal record, with names and dates. The thread had not ended, but it was visible now in a way it hadn't been before. Cole Harlan received a copy of the Commission's preliminary report from Pembroke in January of 1892. He read it in a saloon in Wyoming. He thought about a priest at an altar in the fog, about a man who had said a true thing out loud when he believed he was alone, about 20 years and 5 deaths and a set of documents that a frightened 23-year-old had made copies of because something in him knew the record had to exist. He folded the report, put it in the saddlebag with the other things he carried. Shadow was waiting outside. The road was still long. Edmund Cross was still free, but the record was growing. Cole rode north out of New Mexico on a morning that was clear for the first time in a week. The fog had finally released the Sangre de Cristo Range, and the mountains were visible from their peaks to their roots, red and gray and the specific green of the pinyon trees that grew in the middle elevations. He thought about Father Vela, about 31 years in a diminishing village, about the accumulation of truth that 31 years of confessions produced in a man, about what it did to a person to truly know, with the specificity of individual confession and circumstance, what the people around them had done and been and carried. He thought about the priest at the altar. God forgive me, but those men need killing. 7 words, and the specific quality of a man who had reached the end of one thing and hadn't found anything to replace it with. Not faith exactly. Vela hadn't lost his faith. What he'd lost was his confidence that the institutions of his faith had any reliable relationship with what justice actually was. What he'd found instead was Cole Harlan, walking into his church without announcement, sitting in the last pew, hearing something he wasn't supposed to hear. Cole thought about the way the thread kept finding him. Durango, Colorado Springs, Denver, Wyoming, Montana, Albuquerque, and now north again with Edmund Cross's name in the federal record in a way it hadn't been 3 months ago. He thought about Caleb Dune saying that the most dangerous draw was the one nobody needed to see. He thought about Miguel Castillo's face when he looked at the document with his father's name. He thought about Thomas Abner at 75, giving a deposition in Santa Fe, putting into the official record everything he'd been too afraid to say at 23. The West was changing. The men who had made it what it was were disappearing into the ground, into other lives, into the specific irrelevance of a world that had developed enough institutional structure to not need them anymore. What remained were the edges, the places where the structure was thin, the cases where the man who built the structure was the same man using it as a weapon, and where the only thing that could get between the weapon and the people in its path was a specific kind of person who understood what the weapon was, and who didn't need it to be fair before deciding to act. Shadow walked north. The mountains were behind them. New Mexico was behind them. Father Vela was in his church, probably, doing what priests do in the morning hours, maintaining the thing that needs maintaining, keeping the candles lit, waiting for whoever comes through the door. And somewhere in the territory, Miguel Castillo was alive and moving, and carrying something different than he'd been carrying for 20 years. Not peace, not quite, but the specific thing that happens when a person has done what they set out to do. And the next question is, what they become now that the purpose they built their life around has resolved. Cole didn't know what Miguel would do with that. He didn't need to know. He had done what he'd come to do. Shadow walked north. The road was long. It was always long. And somewhere at the end of it, not the geographical end, but the end of the thread he'd been following for 2 years, Edmund Cross was still free, still alive, still using the law, still using the systems, still using the infrastructure that everyone else depended on as the instrument through which the people who didn't know it could be used. The difference now was the record. The record was growing. And records, Cole had learned in a church in the fog, in an iron box under a floorboard, in the ruling of a federal court. Records were more durable than the men who made them, and more durable than the men who tried to prevent them. Cole Harlan rode north. The legend kept moving. And somewhere in a fog-covered church in the mountains of New Mexico, a priest was probably at his altar again, not saying a true thing this time, or maybe saying it, and maybe, this time, being a little less certain that forgiveness was the wrong thing to ask for. A priest at an altar in a fog. 7 words that changed the direction of a morning. God forgive me, but those men need killing. What do you do with a truth like that? What do you do when the institutions built to produce justice have been the instruments used to prevent it? When the law is the weapon? When the only thing that stands between what happened and what the record says happened is one frightened clerk with a set of copies he made 40 years ago because something in him couldn't let the record not exist? Comment below. 1 word. Who was right? Because this is the question the Old West kept asking, and the New West doesn't have a better answer. Subscribe. Stay for the next one. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. Edmund Cross is still free, but the record is growing. See you on the next road.